पल है अपना तो इस पल में जी ले, शोलों की तरह जरा जल के जी ले, यूं मिले हो आज हमको खो न जाना, कहीं मिटा दूं सारी ये दूरियां, जादू है नशा है मदहोशियां, तुझको भुला के अब जाऊं कहाँ, देखती है जिस तरह से तेरी नजरें मुझे, मैं खुद को छुपाऊं कहाँ, जादू है नशा है मदहोशियां, तुझको भुला के अब जाऊं कहाँ. Hello, 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 ladies and gents, boys and girls, beloved pets, and invisible listeners of all kinds. Lovely to meet you all after a fortnight's break and... Sorry? What? What invisible listeners, you ask? Well, the one sitting right next to you, or standing behind you, behind your chair, or peeking in through the window. Of course, you may not be able to see them, but don't you feel them either? Huh? No? Insensitive clods. But if you can, now that's such a crazy feeling, right? This, as I had promised, is the next stop in our world tour. And this time, you're coming with me all the way to Belarus, the breathtakingly beautiful country where I spent 3 largely happy and wonderfully productive years as India's ambassador. Largely, I say, because there were several personal dark spots, like losing my mother, who'd been living there with me, and nearly dying of COVID-19 myself. Europe's best kept secret, the name Belarus translates into white Russia, not referring to the skin color of the people there, but to the fact that it experiences the prettiest of white winters in that part of the world. Temperatures often dip to minus 30 degrees centigrade, literally freezing the tears on your lashes and the moisture in your nose, the water in your pipes, and the thousands of pristine lakes, both natural and man-made, that dot the country. With my half Eskimo genes, the other half being gypsy, I suspect, I adored the winters that lasted for half the year. I could never get enough of twirling under snowflakes, walking down roads, stretching black between hillocks of shoveled snow and trees that glistened like glass, and walking down lakes frozen solid. And then came the spring, splashing through the hibernating countryside like a joyful, colorful Indian bride flitting through a church full of white-robed nuns. Almost overnight, new green leaves would sprout on frost-coated branches, and within days, a riot of exuberant flowers and fruits in a multitude of hues and fragrances would overwhelm your senses wherever you looked. The earth would shed its white mantle to don a fresh, vibrant green, and people would begin shedding their heavy winter clothing to drink in every drop of the sun as the days grew brighter and ever longer, lingering till almost 11 at night in July. Belarus used to be part of the Soviet Union till August 1991, pretty recently, right? And memories of the deep and warm friendship with India were carried forward into our bilateral relations when it became an independent country. The cultural resonance never did dissipate, and the sheer love that Belarusians have for all things Indian, dance, music, yoga, food, crafts, and films alike, took me aback. Remember what I told you about the happy ignorance I encountered in Spain about India in the late 1980s, early 1990s when I was posted there? Well, Belarus was the exact opposite. Given the tiny size of the resident Indian community, less than 100 all told, plus a migratory group of around 800 medical students who came and went, our cultural events and manifestations were almost entirely dependent on the scores of local artists so adept at Indian dances and music that it was hard to believe that many of them had never even visited India, even though they longed to. Our International Yoga Day was always a riot every year, with hundreds showing up in Minsk and every other city. And when we staged the Ram Leela in Minsk, the audience actually shed tears of gratitude, and there were demands from every cultural festival in the country to bring the show to them. And we'd done all this with local artists, mind you. Not a single person had gone from India, neither an artist nor a musician nor anyone at all. It was all a local effort, and it was so beautiful. The small ISKCON temple in Minsk attracted hundreds of devotees, most of them Belarusians, who would sing and dance for their beloved Krishna with enchanting fervor. Political cooperation, trade, investment, and one-way tourism from Belarus to India flourished, even though the country's name drew blank looks from most Indians. Even when I received my posting orders and informed friends and family, I mostly received delighted but confused smiles. "Congratulations," they would exclaim. But where is Belarus? Well, for those of you who are silently wondering the same thing, the country is situated in East Europe, Central Europe, whatever you want to call it, and shares borders with Russia on the east, Poland on the west, Lithuania in the north, and Ukraine, which has been so much in the news for all the wrong reasons these past couple of years, in the south. Being a history and culture buff, I have always gravitated towards the architecture, the fine arts, the food, and yes, the stories, legends, and myths of the countries I have been posted to. My exploration of Belarus began with Minsk itself, obviously, only to discover that since the city had been literally bombed out of existence during the Second World War, most of what I took to be historical architecture was actually a painstaking recreation of the original. Very beautiful and very well done, but well, not quite the same thing, you know. The embassy staff suggested that I visit the Nesvizh Palace next. Hardly a 90-minute drive from Minsk, and one of the few historical sites to have survived the war without so much as a scratch. The official residence of the powerful Radziwill family since the 16th century BCE, the present structure was constructed between 1582 and 1604, when Belarus was part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and became one of the most important power centers of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. During the centuries that followed, the palace went through cycles of destruction and reconstruction, abandonment and reoccupation, always by the same family, by the way, right up to 1939, when the Soviet Red Army expelled the Radziwills and turned the place into a sanatorium of all things. Can you imagine? Anyway, after Belarus became independent, the palace and its surroundings, which are breathtaking, were extensively restored by the government, and the Nesvizh estate was declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in 2005. Now, this was all very interesting, of course, but there was no way, I was convinced, that a nearly 500-year-old property with its lavish bedchambers and ballrooms, winding corridors, opulent staircases, and cavernous kitchens and cellars wouldn't have its fair share of legends and stories attached. So I asked around and read up what material I could find, and boom, there it was, beckoning slyly from behind the gazy curtains of time and politico-strategic facts. A legend of all-consuming love and illogical hatred, of reckless passion, defiance, and disgust, of murder most foul, and a mistake made by a grieving heart that led to dire consequences. In Belarus, this searing and mystical story is known as the legend of the Black Lady of Nesvizh. But since I'm going to tell it to you in my own style, I'm calling this episode I'll Wait by Heaven's Door. A tender, wistful phrase I've borrowed from a poem called Remember Me by Jenny Graveline. It's available on the net. You can go and check it out if you like. It's a beautiful, beautiful poem. Oh, and in case you were wondering, I chose this exquisite sari and this jewelry for today's episode for two reasons. The first is that this is a royal love story, and I wanted to create that mood and reflect a little bit of that opulence. And the second reason is that it's a very personal one, but equally valid. So this second reason is that this is the sari I wore to present my credentials as India's ambassador to President Lukashenko in Minsk, in his opulent marble and gold presidential palace that forms the perfect backdrop to his grandiose public style. So, to get on with the story. Around the time the Radziwill family was building its fortune, but hadn't yet been granted the estate of Nesvizh in 1533, Jerzy and Barbara Radziwill were blessed with a daughter, the youngest of their brood and the prettiest little baby girl anyone had ever seen. She was named Barbara after her mother. And since the family received the gift of Nesvizh within a few years of Barbara's birth, her parents regarded the child as their lucky charm and treated her like a princess, even though they weren't of royal blood. At that time, the family had no idea that their attitude towards their daughter foreshadowed her unexpected and rather surreal fate. As the little girl grew into a stunningly lovely adolescent, men began to fall for her like ninepins, flocking to her like ants to a drop of honey. As is often the case with beautiful women, unkind and sometimes nasty stories about her began to circulate among the rejected or dejected men who lusted after her. Stories about how she was a heartless flirt, a tease, a seductress who enjoyed bed hopping, a heartless witch. Yes, she was accused of witchcraft too, who routinely used and discarded lovers. Lies, all of them. But as they say, if enough people repeat a lie enough number of times, it acquires a patina of truth. Barbara's family knew she wasn't the slut she was being made out to be, even though she quite enjoyed the attention, the passion, and the jealousies she aroused. But they also knew that the gossip was tainting her reputation. The only reason she wasn't being publicly reviled was the Radzivill's rapid ascent up the political ladder. Barbara was only 13 when the Nesvich estate was granted to her brothers, Mikolaj and Jan, both of whom were older than her, and the family's prestige skyrocketed, turning the Radziwills into one of the most wealthy and powerful families in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. However, while nobody was brave enough to incur their wrath by ostracizing Barbara, the Radziwills knew that the situation couldn't continue indefinitely without damaging their image. Even as they were racking their brains, though, the solution figuratively dropped into their laps, strengthening their belief that Barbara had been born to lead a charmed life and to bless theirs in the process. Now, Barbara's older sister Anna had been betrothed for a while to Stanislovas Gostautas, the influential governor of Novogradak. For some reason, the engagement fell through, but Jerzy Radziwill wasn't one to be discouraged so easily. He went to visit Stanislovas with the 16-year-old Barbara in tow and offered her hand in marriage to the governor in place of the jilted Anna, even though a younger sister marrying before the older one was generally frowned upon, like it is everywhere in most countries, in most cultures. Well, things went exactly the way Jerzy had expected. One look at the gorgeous Barbara and Stanislovas said a resounding yes to the proposal. The wedding took place less than a year later, and the family climbed yet another rung on the ladder of their ambition. That should have been Barbara's happy ending, and perhaps the last stop on her family's road to socio-political prominence. Lady Luck was, however, still in a benevolent mood and had other and even better plans for the young beauty and for the Radziwills. 5 years after the wedding, Governor Gostautas passed away after a brief illness, and his grieving widow, childless and still vividly beautiful at merely 22, returned to her family's bosom. Since Stanislovas died without an heir, most of his wealth and property passed into the hands of Sigismund I, generally referred to as the Old, who was the King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania at that time. Except for a small income, Barbara inherited nothing. Yep. A childless widow, no matter how lovely, didn't count for much in those days. The outcome of the alliance was extremely disappointing for the Radzivills, but they never blamed Barbara for any of it. They really did love her, you see. And now comes the interesting part. In a twist of fate, barely 6 months down the line, King Sigismund the Old transferred the Stanislavas' property to his son and crown prince Sigismund II, also known as Augustus. Young, handsome, and married at that time to Princess Elizabeth of Austria. The story goes that he met Barbara when he traveled to her husband's estate to take possession of the property. Like so many others before him, he succumbed to her splendid looks. But being an honorable man, a trait that defined him all through his life, as you'll see, he chose rectitude over love and decided to adhere to his wedding vows. Luckily for him, and most certainly for the Radzivills, Elizabeth conveniently died a year and a half later, reportedly of an epileptic seizure, but, well, don't you wonder if someone other than fate took a discreet hand in advancing her tryst with God? Maybe, maybe not. I'm just saying. Anyway, it seems that his wife's timely demise opened the doors, quite literally, for Sigismund Augustus into Barbara's heart, and shortly thereafter into her bedroom. She became the mistress of the crown prince, apparently with the family's approval and support. And tales of their rather public liaison soon became rampant. Anxious to avoid their son's long-term entanglement with a woman with no pretensions to royalty, Sigismund the Old and his Italian wife, Bona Sforza, began hunting for a suitably royal bride for their bereaved son. And that was when the Radziwill family, brothers and cousins, uncles and other relatives, stepped in, insisting that the besotted prince make an honest woman of Barbara. Morality, of course, was not the only consideration. At least a part of their motive was to secure an even higher status for themselves as relatives of the crown. For Sigismund Augustus, though, it was more a matter of following his heart. After a 2-year-long relationship with the incomparable Barbara, he was deeply, irrevocably in love with her. Now you know why I started this episode with that particular song of passion and almost insane desire. So, he decided to wed her in secret and then present his disapproving parents and their outraged court with a fait accompli. And that's precisely what he did. Braced for the predictable reactions. What he hadn't foreseen, though, was the sheer vehemence of the opposition he faced. Not only was the entire Polish aristocracy enraged by what they thought of as his unwise choice of bride, his mother, Bona Sforza, hated the upstart Radzywills for their ambition and audacity. She simply refused to accept her son's new bride into the royal family. Things came to such a pass that the Catholic Church was persuaded to offer Sigismund Augustus the unheard of option of a divorce condoned by the church, with the sin of the act being equitably distributed among the entire population of the state, so that everyone ended up paying 0.001% or something of the consequences of that sin. A brilliant arrangement, right? Although I wonder if even an informal referendum was held to find out how the man on the street felt about being roasted over a hellfire for somebody else's deed. As you'd expect, though, from what you've heard so far about his all-consuming love for the sultry and sexy Barbara, Sigismund refused to listen to the aggravating counsel of his family, his nobles, and even the church. He simply refused to be sundered from his beloved wife. Ultimately, the entire country had to surrender to the force of his passion, and Barbara was finally crowned Queen of Poland and Grand Duchess of Lithuania in the winter of the year 1550, after the passing of Sigismund the Old. There were grumblings and resentments galore, but what could anybody do but accept the inevitable? Everybody, that is, except Queen Mother Bona Sforza, as implacable in her hatred as her son was in his love. Disgusted and furious, she commandeered almost the entire royal court and moved with her retinue to Italy, rather than live in the same city and the same palace as her disobedient son and her despised daughter-in-law. You know, sometimes I really wonder why mothers of besotted men even bother to try and turn their sons away from the lures of a beauteous young woman, be she a girlfriend, a consort, or a wife. I mean, you get to watch this battle again and again in books, movies, and even in the pages of recorded history, and every time it's the mother who loses. After all, your son's love interest is younger, prettier, and sleeps with him. a combo you just can't beat. So why not accept defeat gracefully and move on? But for some reason, none of these mothers seem to understand this. Bona Sforza was no exception. The dark, sinister tale of blood, betrayal, and blasphemy that has crossed centuries to resound as convincingly today as it did when it happened half a millennia ago will stroke an icy finger down your spine. If you read bland history, what happened to Barbara sounds like a tragedy, or, for the less forgiving, the wages of sin. Just punishment for a woman with the morals of an alley cat, as many claimed then and continue to believe today. The legend of the Dark Lady, however, is woven around something far more malevolent, not to mention surreal, and even mystical. Now, on the face of it, Bona Sforza was left with no option but that of accepting the upstart royalty of a detested daughter-in-law and, by association, of the wily and opportunist Radziwills, who now enjoyed the power and prestige that came with their closeness to the throne. Her heart and sensibilities, however, burned with the rage and humiliation of being replaced on that very throne by a gold digger who, in her eyes, had nothing to recommend her except her pretty face and a body men would kill for. Everybody wants a body like Sheila. Ain't nobody's got a body like Sheila. And so on. The venom of hatred overwhelmed her righteousness, they say. Before she left for Italy, she found herself an apothecary to assist her in her heinous designs. In return for the bag of gold she placed in his hands. Now, at this point, I must let you into Bona Sforza's little secret. A rather sinister little secret. We already know that Sigismund's mother was Italian, right? But the crucial fact that hasn't yet been mentioned is that the Sforzas were contemporaries of Italy's most notorious family of all times. Can you guess who I'm referring to? Yes? Well, bingo! Bully for you. But if your answer is no, here's the drum roll. The House of Borgia is what I'm talking about. The ones who issued fatal invitations for dinner to their real and perceived enemies. These special guests were then wined and dined in style, all very warm and cordial, except that the food and drinks served to the chosen invitees were laced with all kinds of exotic toxins. Toxins that killed them slowly or instantly, depending on the urgency of the situation. The house of Sforza, along with other noble families like the Medicis, had been at daggers drawn with the Borgias for years and had suffered the venomous consequences of that bitter political rivalry. In the process, however, they had also learned to appreciate the quick, anonymous, and infallible efficiency of poison for disposing of an enemy, as opposed to the messy and usually incriminating bloodletting with a dagger in the neck or a sword in the belly. Far less dramatic and much cleaner all around. The house of Sforza did not really adopt this Borgia habit, but our Bona seems to have tucked away the idea for future use. So, even as she set sail for Italy, the apothecary she had handpicked set to work. At her behest, the man brewed a poison, one that would slowly invade the bloodstream of the victim, curdling it as the weeks and months went by, until the abused body couldn't take punishment anymore and succumbed to a horrid, painful death. This toxin was then mixed with Barbara's food and wine, small doses at a time, so as not to evoke any suspicion. Just as the apothecary had assured the Queen Mother, bit by bit, the venom began to act on Barbara's system. At first, it manifested as a rash that wouldn't go away, turning the warm silk of her skin rough and scaly. The royal physicians who were called in to examine the ailing queen initially diagnosed her condition as a dermal infection of some sort, prescribing herbs and teas, balms and creams to relieve the discomfort. And anxious Sigismund was relieved when these remedies seemed to help initially, but their effect was temporary. As the poison accumulated in Barbara's system, the malady grew worse. The rashes turned into pustules and boils, horrible to look at and so painful that the poor queen would sob and cry out, begging her beloved Sigismund to do something. The physicians tried everything they could, from potions to prayers, but alas, to no avail. The apothecary, with Bona's gold fattening his purse, was relentless in his efforts. Each time the physicians came up with some innovative new treatment, Bona's man adjusted the dosage of the venom he was slipping into the pitifully few mouthfuls of food and water the queen was still able to consume. Within a few hours, her condition would start deteriorating again. This medical drama fueled the gossip mills once more. Those who disliked poor Barbara, resenting her for her looks and her luck in trapping the king into marriage, were delighted to watch her suffer as her legendary beauty faded, her face turning gaunt and her body growing uglier and more diseased by the day. Some kinder souls speculated that she had probably overdosed herself with dubious concoctions meant to encourage pregnancy and had thus unknowingly poisoned herself. There were others, though, who found that explanation too tame for their taste. So they raked up all the old salacious and malicious gossip that had lain dormant for a while but had never quite gone away. Gossip about her loose morals and her man-eating ways, about how she had always used her wiles and witchcraft to seduce men, including, they muttered, the king himself, and lured them to her bed. A leopard, said these worthies sternly, could never really change its spots. So, once she had Sigismund completely under her spell, she had decided to go back to her bad old ways with a vengeance. What she was suffering now was merely the wages of sin. Some horrid disease she had picked up from one or the other of her plethora of lovers. Serves her right, they said. A woman like that deserves no better. That's what most human beings are like, aren't they? How quickly admiration turns into resentment and envy mutates into jealousy. Rather than drawing a bigger line for ourselves, most of us diligently get down to scrubbing away the other person's line to make it shorter than our own. And if that person happens to be a woman, and a beautiful woman at that, well, God help her. Sadly, in Barbara's case, God chose not to do so. 6 months after she was crowned queen, she succumbed to the poison her obdurate mother-in-law had left behind to destroy her youth, her beauty, and ultimately her life. An inconsolable Sigismund wept like a child by his wife's deathbed as the blazing beauty he had married, and who was now little more than a bundle of rancid flesh and brittle bones, breathed her last. There is a stunning canvas that hangs in the Neschwitz castle, painted by Joseph Zimmler in 1860, depicting the poignant moment of Barbara's passing. Even though it was rendered more than 300 years after her tragic death, it's a heartbreaking homage to the legendary love between the couple. Through his bride's prolonged and painful illness, Sigismund's passion and devotion had never wavered. Not once had he felt repelled by whatever foul disease she had contracted, and had never, even in a weak moment, believed a single ugly rumor circulating through the palace and hovering over the city like a wake of vultures. Some of the courtiers who had a good idea of how much Bona Sforza had hated her unwanted daughter-in-law and the lengths to which she could go to spite fate, had opted not to accompany her to Italy. More sympathetic to Sigismund than to her, they had attempted to convey their suspicions to him. Suspicions that his Italian mother had somehow managed to have his bride poisoned. Sigismund, though, had dismissed that as mere malicious speculation, unable to believe that the woman who had birthed him was capable of committing such an unforgivable crime, that she would deliberately set out to destroy her son's happiness merely to soothe her injured ego. He had focused instead on praying night and day for Barbara's recovery, donating to the church, and handing out alms to the poor in her name. During that time, he relied on his trusted advisors, including, of course, Barbara's 2 brothers, to handle all routine matters of state, particularly those that required his presence outside the city, for he refused to distance himself, even temporarily, from his ailing queen. How amazing, right? And now his beloved was dead, gone from him forever. And he felt incomplete, insubstantial, totally shattered. While Bona Sforza celebrated her grim victory in Italy, her son simply went to pieces, so devastated that he was barely functional. He accompanied his bride's coffin to the cathedral in Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania and Barbara's childhood home, and watched her royal burial with dry, empty eyes. His ministers and courtiers feared he would do something stupid, maybe try to take his own life, and they gathered around him, watching and guarding him as they waited for his searing grief to subside. To their chagrin, however, they realized that rather than driving a wedge between them, Barbara's death had served to bring her husband and her brothers even closer to each other. You would understand why. These were, after all, the only 3 men, aside from her now dead father, who had truly loved her and who had the most reason to miss her deeply. In the case of her brothers, the genuine affection was tempered perhaps with a bit of selfishness. But for Sigismund, Barbara had been his raison d'etre, his reason to exist, ever since fate had brought them together. The king would visit his brothers-in-law frequently or would summon them to his palace and would find solace from their conversations about and shared memories of the dead woman. It was during one such meeting that the seed of the eerie idea was conceived. By which of the three I couldn't say, but one thing became increasingly apparent. The idea invaded the deepest level of Sigismund's awareness and took root there. So much so that it became an obsession. No matter where he was and what he was doing, he could think of little else. And wickedly, this is the edge of the precipice where I shall leave you today, because I need a hook to pull you back into the next episode, When you return after a fortnight to Tattle Tales with Sangeeta Bahadur to listen to the concluding part of this royal story, you'll find out what that idea was and its horrific, tragic consequences that have outlived both Sigismund and Barbara, still extracting an agonizing price from the star-crossed lovers. And in the meanwhile, as usual, let me repeat once more, please don't forget to like, subscribe and share the channel and the stories I'm telling here with your friends, family, teachers, students, colleagues and acquaintances. Because, as they say, sharing the joy with others doubles it for you. So do it for your own selfish reasons. Goodbye for now. And as that old Hindi song goes, in the days of real Indo-Russian camaraderie, फिर मिलेंगे जाने वाले यार 10वीं दानियाँ, लौट कर आओगे तुम 100 बार 10वीं दानियाँ, फिर मिलेंगे जाने वाले यार 10वीं दानियाँ.